Right. Welcome to this ESCoE seminar on evaluating the success of the economy, basic needs and well-being. I'm delighted to introduce Michael Joffe to you. Michael is an epidemiologist who has a long history of working in that area, but in recent years he's looked at evaluating this, the social economy using methods that are used in the natural sciences. So Michael is going to give us a different perspective on these questions that we have been debating for some time. Michael will speak for 35 minutes, and then we'll have a Richard Hayes from ONS will be a discussant on this paper, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. Please put your questions and answers, your questions in the Q&A box, and once we have some questions, we'll unmute you and you can ask your questions. So, Michael, it's over to you.
Well, I'll be talking today not so much about beyond GDP, but more about GDP and beyond, because I'm not advocating getting rid of GDP, which I don't think is feasible. I think GDP is indispensable for economic management, but it's been widely criticized from its inception in the mid-20th century that it's not appropriate for evaluating the success of an economy, and I think everybody probably knows that. The implication is that an additional element is needed that's complementary to GDP, that focuses on the economy like GDP does, but evaluates the degree of economic success. And it's important that this wouldn't be susceptible to the main traditional criticisms of GDP, which is that it counts harmful products and activities as well as good ones, that it neglects inequalities, and that it ignores unpaid labor. So that means we have to deal with the question, what do we mean by economic success? And the task is to develop a measure and then to put that into a monitoring system that corresponds to economic success. But I'm still keeping the SNA definition of what the economy is and just adding unpaid labor to that. And I've put the SNA definition, but I don't need to go through that. That's kind of well known. I've included unpaid labor as well, because as well as it being part of the standard criticism, as I just said, paid and unpaid labor are substitutable, so it makes sense to count them together. So the question is, what is it about the economy that is valuable? What we need is a value system that's made explicit and that commands widespread support. I have to say that I now work mainly as an economist, and as Mary said in her introduction, I've also worked in the past as an epidemiologist. So I'm more comfortable with objectivity and science than I am with value systems. But I think when we're dealing with this particular question, we actually can't do without a value system, because success is a criterion that requires one to know what's good and what's less good and what's bad. So what I've come up with is that the satisfaction of basic needs is the main focus. And the phrase that's used is leave no one behind. It's from the Sustainable Development Goals. It's also obviously been used in a lot of other contexts. Everyone's basic needs should, as far as possible, be met. And it's not just the SDGs, it's also some survey evidence that finds widespread support for the view. It's not universal, but it's widespread enough to be useful for this purpose, I think. So the international agreements like the Sustainable Development Goals and surveys both find this shared value system widely prevalent. And the point I want to make here is that this is across very diverse cultures, because obviously the United Nations SDGs, it's international. It's a lot of very different cultures, as well as the different political beliefs. And the foundation is based on the dignity of everybody. It promotes inclusion, social justice, facilitates agency and aspiration. These are all kind of things which the United Nations aims to promote across the world. So what we're talking about is a minimal acceptable degree of economic well-being in a form that people can really understand, not just professionals like ourselves or government or other related professions, but that ordinary people can relate to this, and so it can inform public discussion, which is really important as a basis for democratic policy development. So I'm talking about a responsible economy. So we're talking about the economy, but one where we're talking about the value system, both of responsibility for others and for the environment. I talk less about the environment in this presentation because I have to keep it relatively short. So the implication is that we should monitor economic outcomes, and examples I've given here on the slide, that livelihoods should be of decent quality and security, same thing with homes, and nurturing an educative environment for children and access to appropriate types of care. There's more of them, and I'll show you a slide later on with some other suggestions, but that's the kind of basic idea of what I'm talking about. And it's in the economy, we're talking about these being provided by economic outcomes, which is distinct from economic outputs. So I'm calling the fulfillment of human needs outcomes, and outputs like housing, food, education, care, and so on are what a good economy provides. And obviously livelihoods and income are also part of what a good economy provides. So that's part of what I'm counting in my output and outcome scope. And GDP is, in one of its three manifestations, obviously the sum of all incomes. So that's where GDP fits in. They correspond respectively to ends and means. So I'm talking about economic outcomes, or the meeting of basic needs, as ends, and these economic outputs like GDP as means. So the idea is to provide an objective and an incentive and a criterion of success for policy development that relates to the economy, which includes major policy that's not specifically economic but has big economic implications. Now, an important part of what I'm saying is that if we take this value system as a basis, we need to incorporate that in the metric in which we provide data to people who want to use it. So I call that the proportion unfulfilled, and an example of that that's conventionally used is the unemployment rate, which is presented as a proportion, obviously. And I'm suggesting that what should be provided for this purpose of assessing the success of an economy should be provided in that format. One advantage of doing that is that it builds in inequality at the lower end of the income or wealth scale. So we don't really need to worry about separate measures of inequality, which is a problem with other measures, including GDP, that people talk about, well, that's only an aggregate or an average value. So the basic concept that I have is that these are related to the stages of production. I'm concentrating on output and outcomes here, but what's important in the outcomes is that they also have an impact on health and happiness, or subjective well-being. I use happiness and subjective well-being as synonyms. There's also the assets aspect, but I'm not going to talk about that today. There's a lot of good work on that proceeding in recent years, and that's a kind of separate thing, but this is the kind of structure I'm working with. I call the health and happiness impact as distinct from outcomes. So those are the four kind of basic categories. Just as an aside, when I'm talking about health here, I'm not talking about healthcare. I'm not talking about specific lifestyle risk factors like smoking, but to the social determinants of health. And that is the WHO definition of that. And WHO say that it's of those three divisions, it's actually the most important. It's maybe a half or thereabouts of health outcomes are derived from these living conditions. I should say that in that figure I just showed you, that's just about the economy. So it doesn't include things like trust, safety, governance. I'm not saying they're unimportant. They are very, very important, but they're a separate thing. So they require a complementary monitoring system, and I'm not talking about that today. I haven't got time to go into that sort of detail. So let's just think about the Sustainable Development Goals briefly for a moment, which is kind of part of the inspiration of this, and what I'm saying is connected with it. But it's separate from that, because I'm talking primarily to a rich country context, and I'll come to that in a moment. So out of the 169 targets for the goals, 23 are actually economic outcomes in the sense I've used here, and I've listed them on the slide. I'm not going to read them out. And this includes things which are in broader goals, like reducing, or actually abolishing poverty, reducing inequality, including with gender, as well as more economic sorts of inequalities. The goals also include a lot else, and again, I'm not going to read this all out, but you can read what's on the slide. So the difference between what I'm saying and the SDG perspective is that I'm talking just about the economic outcomes in what I'm doing, and at least for the purposes of this presentation and the book that I'm about to bring out, I'm just talking about the outcomes that were on the previous slide, these ones. Just to say that all of the goals are concerned either with means of either with the economic outcomes or means of achieving them, or on environmental sustainability and the means of achieving that, which I think is very important. But again, I haven't got time to go into that in detail. And so to come to the context that I'm talking about here, I'm just talking about the rich country context, and there's three reasons for that. First of all, we talk about the rich world, and people often misleadingly talk about the UK as the fifth richest country in the world. It's not actually, because I think they're using GDP rather than per capita GDP, but that's an aside. But in pretty much all rich countries, there are pockets of deprivation. And if one takes just GDP per capita as the average or aggregate, then you have to have separate attention to these inequalities that are not captured. And it is possible, not only possible, it happens quite a great deal in all sorts of economies, actually. The GDP grows, but the least fortunate are not included. So second reason is that there's a lot of consumption that is damaging, and so we should concentrate on what contributes to the most vulnerable people. I don't really like the word vulnerable, but you understand what I mean. Because we're exceeding planetary boundaries, and this is a serious problem. The third reason is a practical thing, is that I'm talking about a context in which we could actually readily take action in a country like the UK or in an international organization. And in doing that, I would want it to be borne in mind how that could be extended to lower and middle income countries in the future. Obviously, that would have to be adapted. I'm not going to spend time on this slide because I'm short of time, but if you just have a look, these are suggested. There are 40 of them. They're candidates. I'm not suggesting anything like this number would be included as a monitoring system, but they're things that should be considered. There's already information collected on most of these topics, either by national statistical agencies or OECD's done work on this. There are also voluntary organizations that collect this sort of information. It's feasible, it's acceptable, and it's at least relatively affordable. And as I said, the proportion unfulfilled is the main way that I think this kind of information should be presented for the purpose I'm talking about. It corresponds to the value system, as I said, and as I also said, it gives an idea of distribution or of inequality, whereas something like a measure of dispersion, like the standard deviation, is not as informative. An example would be one could look at housing density, and if you look at the mean or even the median, that wouldn't be very informative, because what we really want to know is how many people just don't have enough space for what they need. And so one would need a threshold for that. I'm suggesting the old Parker Morris standards, but that could be discussed. The simple thing is to have one threshold, but to preserve information, in some cases, one might want to have multiple thresholds. Now, as well as the format of the proportion unfulfilled, the other important thing I want to say is that there's a big advantage of monitoring determinants rather than impacts. So ONS have happiness index for more than 10 years now, are developing a health index. And it's important to know this, but it doesn't tell you where interventions need to be made to do something that would benefit the situation. Just briefly, high blood pressure has a health analogy. It's got advantages in monitoring it, not least that it occurs early, so you can take preventive action. Similarly, I was involved with perinatal mortality rates. People said, what should the target be? I said the target should be all the relative interventions that could reduce it should be carried out. So you need actually to be monitoring the interventions or the determinants. So that means monitoring intermediate outcomes, and that's why I'm suggesting, as in the figure, the stage before the impacts on health and happiness, the economic outcomes. And so to pick up what I said in the last slide, insecure housing applies across the whole population, that's statistically efficient. It would be difficult to find out how much anxiety that exists are due to that. And also in terms of timing, one could have preventive action. And important also is that it helps set the agenda, because it shows you which parts of the economy require intervention. So you can use that for agenda setting. It doesn't tell you what the intervention should be, and I think that's important to get wide support for this proposal, because it leaves room for people to debate policies based on their own values. So it could be supported by a whole range of people with different political views. But the other thing that needs to be taken into account, obviously, is the effectiveness and cost effectiveness of intervention. So I envisage a debate based on those two things. Now, the satisfaction of basic needs is intrinsically valuable. The means to achieving those are, as I said, the economic outcomes. And in the table I briefly showed you, a lot of what I showed, and this is true of the Sustainable Development Goals too, is expressed in terms of access to. So that can be public provision, it can be affordability, giving pensions or benefits or whatever. And I don't distinguish between those two, because the important thing is that the needs should be met. There is another aspect to this, that meeting people's basic needs actually helps them in all sorts of ways. I've put literacy up there as an example. But that's also a means to an end, and it's very important. But in this particular exercise, I'm concerned with the economic outcomes as important in themselves to improve people's lives. And the economic benefits of doing so is something else on top of that. Okay, just to a few technical things. This proportion unfulfilled way of metric, way of representing things, means that hard to reach groups must be included, and that possibly a challenge, but it's a necessary challenge. And I think it's a challenge whatever metric you use, actually, but it's particularly important here. Comparisons can be made across time and space. I'm suggesting quarterly. I'm in favor of international standardization, but obviously there's that's also slightly challenging, because different countries like to do things their own way and they have established systems, but it is desirable. There would have to be a discussion about how one would modify this for middle-income countries and lower-income countries. But the idea is eventually that one could have a unified system, but differentiated according to the needs of different levels. And that could be useful, I think, in the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm not going to go into any of that technical stuff today. The inclusion criteria for the items to monitor. So I showed you that slide with 40 items on it. But what one really needs is to have a set that have good inclusion criteria. And so going back to the figure, they arise from economic outputs. There are economic outcomes, obviously. And secondly, they have an impact on health and/or happiness, subjective well-being. So how would this the output of a monitoring system of this kind be presented? Well, I'm suggesting it can be done in two ways, so that discussion of dashboard and single index, which is often done as an either-or discussion. What are the strengths and weaknesses of each? I'm saying that this approach lends itself to being presented in both formats. The indicators, obviously, I've said about how they should be presented. They could be used in statistical analysis and used in research and so on, but in practice, it's not. In national statistics, it's not the sort of thing that is widely used. People like to use the index that is a single aggregate measure. And I'm suggesting an index that I call the IEO, the Index of Economic Outcomes, can be done to for that purpose, and that would be useful for policymakers, but also for people who use statistics, public statistics. And obviously the problem here is an aggregation principle, and I've got an aggregation principle which is based on how much each of the items contributes to health and or subjective well-being. And in principle, this can be done from measuring, and I'll show you briefly the formula in a moment. There's a long-established and rich literature on social determinants of health, also environmental determinants relevant here, but social is the main thing. And rapidly catching up with that is a similar literature on the determinants of subjective well-being that includes these economic outcomes. So there's obviously much else that affects subjective well-being. The weights would be calculated using this population attributable fraction that I'll come to in a moment, which is the standard measure in epidemiology. I'm not saying it's ready to go as a measurement system, because what's needed here is for each item that's selected, one needs a good estimate of its causal impact adjusted for the others, and the literature hasn't reached that stage yet, or it has for a few determinants, I think, but not. One can't make a general statement that it's available across the board. And so one would have to start off by relying on expert opinion with experts in the various fields covered by all the items that I'm suggesting should be candidates. And before I get to the statistical measure aspect, I just want to make a few observations about this proposed index of economic outcomes. How am I doing time-wise, Mary? Have I got
about 6 or 7 minutes?
Right. Okay. I'll have to leave some of the optional items out, but I'll just deal with this briefly. If you look at the relationship of any measure of well-being, subjective or objective, like health, and any measure of prosperity, even something like electricity usage or something like that, there's a strong gradient in lower and medium income countries, but little or no relationship in rich societies. So, and that's reflected in the observation that a lot of what people like ourselves, or most, I'm speaking for myself here, but I think most of us, that we have some extra bonus consumption that it makes life nice, but we could actually live without. And I've listed some things there, but I won't go into the details. An important aspect of this proposed IEO is that one can say what resources are needed to meet it. So that's a productivity concept. I'm proposing this efficiency ratio. So then real per capita GDP becomes the denominator. And similarly, and I think more importantly, because environmental sustainability is an important motivating factor here, is a sustainability ratio, either for environment in general or for carbon equivalent for greenhouse gases, which can be regarded as a measure of sustainable development. I won't go into this in detail because I don't have time, but just to say that one aspect in the beyond GDP discussion that is directly relevant, because the previous slide was mostly ways in which the beyond GDP world is a little too diffuse and not specific enough, but there's an initiative by the OECD and the European Union to move towards what they call an economy of well-being. And in this slide, I just set out what they say about this, and it very similar to what I've been talking about here. So there's a lot of possibility of synergy of these approaches. Just briefly, I'm not going to talk at all about the actual formulae, but just to say the original version of the population attributable fraction is about events, so deaths or new cases, and that involves the proportion unfulfilled. But importantly, you can use it in a, instead of, for example, number of deaths, you can use it for years of life lost. This is what is in this number 8 here, and that's a standard thing. And once you've got that, you can say, well, you can talk about the loss of quality of a year, which means that you can incorporate health-related quality of life. You can talk about subjective well-being and happiness in that same context, using measures which have actually already been long time ago developed for the health field and are being developed in subjective well-being. And it's a matter of pulling all that together. And then finally, in number 9, it's the way the different items are aggregated to form a single weighted index. So to conclude, I make 7 contributions. I've only talked about 5 of them here because this is all in a book that's going to come out quite soon. I hope it's completed now. So I've, in the figure, I showed the various types of indicators and how they're related to value creation in the economy. Secondly, I've talked about what an economic outcome is and how that's related to the satisfaction of basic human needs. I've got a list of initial suggestion, which was that table of 40 items, but that's just initial suggestions. It need to be probably reduced greatly in number, and that's for discussion with experts and concerned people. I've not talked about the principles, but that's in the book. I've also talked about how the aggregation would be done in principle to create the IEO. I've not talked about the inclusion of health at length, and that again is in the book, but I don't have time for it. I've never understood why it's accepted that we should be aiming at subjective well-being, but not at objective well-being, which is what health is. But anyway, that's left aside for now. And finally, on this slide, the efficiency ratio and the sustainable ratio, which I think are really important ways of using the this approach. Just to put this back in context with what's going on in a broader context in the world, in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and in the broader context of what the United Nations in doing. The UN produced this document, many of you may have seen it, called Our Common Agenda, in which he asked for a measure of economic prosperity and progress that's distinct from GDP, obviously complementary to it. It's all that I'm putting forward, this economic outcomes methodology and its aggregate, which is the IEO. It's focused on and specific to the economy, unlike a lot of the beyond GDP world, which I didn't have time to go into in detail, but I think most people know something about that. So the focus on the economy means it occupies the same space as GDP, plus GDP would have to have unpaid labor added to it to be absolutely covering the same space. It has a rigorous conceptual basis on these outcomes and so on. There's quite a lot I didn't say about the conceptual basis and its relationship to across social science and philosophical disciplines. There's a whole discussion on that, which is kind of congruent with what I've been saying. It's based on a clear value system and the corresponding metric, which was the proportion unfulfilled. Again, just to reiterate the same point, it enables trade-offs and synergies, and in particular, the sustainability ratio, which I think is an advantage. And the last of the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals is to develop measurements of progress on sustainable development to complement gross domestic product. And that's what I've tried to do, and I hope I've convinced people that I've at least got some way towards that, and that at least it can inform the debate which is currently underway. So thank you, and the provisional title for the book is on the screen. It's going to be published in the series Wellbeing in Politics and Policy by Palgrave Macmillan, and my email address is on the screen in case anybody wants to contact me, and I'll be very happy to discuss things with anybody who's interested.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael, for a fascinating talk. Before we go to questions, I think it's good to get the perspective of a National Statistical Office. So we're delighted to have Richard Hayes here to discuss this paper. So Richard, you have about 10 minutes.
Excellent. I'm just going to bring up some slides. Hopefully you can see the slides. Can you see the
slides? Yes, that's
Mary?
fine. Yes, I can see the slides, so fine. Yeah.
Excellent. So I'm going to try and work hard to not use all the time up and leave some space for questions, but this is a very, very good paper in my opinion, and well worth people spending some time looking at and thinking about. So I'm going to pick up on a couple of the points which Michael has actually focused in on as well in his talk. But just a bit of context, I think it is always important to say the UK is probably one of the richest countries in terms of research into beyond GDP and well-being. I think the UK has focused relatively more on subjective well-being than some of our international peers. And I think that is important for us to think about when we're presenting this material, how we join it up into that international debate, as Michael's alluded to. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second. But one of the things here is that beyond GDP is a really ugly label that means lots of different things to lots and lots of different communities. And I think one of the things that Michael started off with was saying, is this beyond GDP? Is this GDP and beyond? Is this well-being? Is a really, really important debate, because if we want to get people wider than our sort of the statistical or academic community to understand what we are talking about here, we need jargon which is a lot more user-friendly than beyond GDP. So I'm entirely supportive on that front. And I think the point that Michael raised about this being a very diffuse landscape is completely correct. The work we've done with the United Nations network of economic statisticians is very clear, has informed me and has made it very clear that there's been no shortage of effort post Stiglitz-Sen and Fitoussi to think about this issue. But there has been a challenge around joining up and bringing people together and synthesizing that knowledge. And I think purely from an NSI perspective, I think one of the things that was particularly powerful in the Common Agenda document that Michael referenced from the UN Secretary General was the recognition that building international statistical capacity to generate some of these data is something that can't be done on the cheap, and that there is a real need internationally to build capacity in the international community to actually be able to generate some of these data in a consistent fashion that we can then utilize. And I think I would also go a bit further than Michael did in saying, for me, I have a feeling that there is a growing consensus when I look at work from the OECD, from the UN network, when I look at the work that Michael referenced on a wellbeing economy from Eurostat, I see a lot of very, very common movement. And it's one of the things I think I will conclude was to say, it's very reassuring when one sees independent research teams generally coming to what is essentially a common set of proposals. And I think they are informed by some very, very key three or four pertinent facts that I've put up here. That we are talking about a world that has a growing need for data around some of these issues, whether it is thinking about the environment, thinking about various interrelationships between the economy and society. All NSIs work within constrained resources. Obviously, we all have fixed budgets. And if we want to do more stuff, if we want more measures, we need to think about how we fund that. Equally, we need to think about the other big limitation, which is time. We know about the global warming position. We know about the targets for 2030, 2050. We know about the various pressures on us here. And so, much like Michael, I see a lot of people leaning on national accounts style methodologies because we just don't have the luxury of devising whole new approaches to this. And similarly, I think, as Michael made reference to unpaid labour, and I'm going to talk a little bit more widely about this in just a moment, what is the value of these satellite accounts that many national statistics institutes have generated if we don't begin to use them and use them in anger? And aggregation, as Michael is suggesting, is one of the first key steps. That probably is a little bit too advanced for where the SNA revision is, which has been focusing more on how we actually produce that data. But I think that is completely fine. I think the SNA needs to do a very particular job, which is generating this data. I think the question of how to generate a well-being framework is one that needs to lie elsewhere. The SNA needs to retain that centrality as an economic measurement system. I'm not going to go into a lot of the maths, but this is very much how we try to sell this story when we think about inclusive income, which is the ONS's contribution to this debate. And really the point of bringing together various capitals, capital human, capital natural, as well as capital produced in that equation just above 1 star. Once you think that through and feed it through, you end up with something which looks very, very similar to this, which is what Michael's just shown us. Now, there are some questions here. Is social capital a real capital, or is it just a conditioning factor, as Partha Dasgupta has described it, which affects the value we put on human, natural, and produced assets? How do we think about this production chain? Is there anything else we need to include if we're thinking about the natural world? And I think that where Michael references adding unpaid labour and the output from unpaid labour, we do really need to be thinking about the value we get from ecosystem services. So peatland absorbing carbon, or wetlands which absorb floodwaters and prevent cities and towns flooding. These are real values, real services, and I think they're very important to work out within this landscape how you would take an output from that natural capital and feed it through. It's not just about human activity. Which is, I think, effectively the point I'm making with the top red circle here. Unpaid labour is a really important start, and if you look at our inclusive income data that try to do this on the ONS website, you'll see it plays a really fundamental part, but you can't ignore some of those wider effects, particularly the environment. And then we get to this point about a value system, and I think this is really, really important. When one thinks about national accounts, it does attempt to be relatively value neutral, because it includes, as Michael mentioned, goods and bads, things like cigarettes, armaments, drugs, and of course, efforts to add, it's very easy to aggregate. I say that, very easy. Let's say it's doable to aggregate data on top of GDP and take that as a base. If you're trying to strip things out of GDP before you get there, that obviously introduces a degree of complexity. I will come back onto that in a second, because I think one of the areas that Michael does reference may give us a way to shortcut that problem. Michael, I completely agree with Michael around the issues related to aggregation. This is something that I know I personally spend an awful lot of time on. I think others in the international community are thinking about this as well. There are, GDP uses money weights, money market prices, money weights to do this. Michael has indicated we could use contributions to health and subjective well-being. Time is also suggested by Leonard Nakamura and Diane Coyle as a different way of doing this. I think this is a really, really important research agenda that's going to need a lot of investment to get us to a finishing line. Now, just to touch on the work the UN Network has been doing, I referenced this earlier. We're in the final stages of preparing a report for the UN Statistical Commission in 2024, which should hopefully be reaching sort of final draft stage in the next couple of weeks. And we're very much proposing a model which looks an awful lot like that horizontal line that Michael gave us just a couple of slides ago, in this sort of vertical pyramid, where I think you start with the capitals to think about the sustainability position. You then have those policy-facing domains, those sort of key measures which impact on your ability to deliver that final outcome, which I have here as subjective well-being. Michael tries to achieve that balance between subjective and objective well-being. Again, there the problem is the issue of bads. Someone who smokes 50 cigarettes a day is taking a conscious decision to erode their objective well-being, presumably because they believe their subjective well-being is improved by doing that, and therefore this question of subsidiarity, where you put these against each other, I think is a key question. Just coming back onto this question of weights and composites and dashboards, which Michael raised. This is I've been a little bit cheeky with the data on the left-hand side here. So the UK measures of national well-being, our dashboard. This is I've chosen sort of our two strongest composite numbers and probably one of our weakest representations. This being not the actual data, it being a document that we prepared for a July presentation to showcase what we were capable of in this space. Now, we had around 250 people attend that event. So you can beef that number from 50 up to about 300 just by including the people who attended that event, and page views are not everything. But again, even if you do that, we're seeing in sort of the pragmatic real world, the composite indexes are easily defeating their dashboard peers, despite the fact they can be hard to produce and they can be simple to use, but sometimes over simple to use. I think that we have some important questions there to answer in terms of how best to balance between these. Finally, just touching on that weighting issue once more, this idea of developing effectively deflators that take you from the drivers through to subjective well-being is not a trivial task at all. I think we'd all agree with that, but I think that doesn't mean it's not necessary. I can definitely see good reasons for it, and it might allow you to get around that problem of bads if within that framework you give those bads 0 or negative weight. So you run them through the process, but then you knock them out at the final stage. I can see some merits in some of those types of approaches. But I think the key quick thing here is that, as Michael alluded to as well, these deflators or weights or whatever you want to label them as, they are going to need to be regularly revised. They are going to need to be kept up to date, and they're going to become, they would need to be a large part of a statistical system that was attempting to do this. So in conclusion, not to take everyone's time too much, I think this is a really important and timely paper. I think the fact that separate research teams are effectively coming to the same logical conclusions, even if we have slight differentials in what are the factors, domains we want to include, and how exactly we're thinking about weighting things, I think everyone's coming to the same sort of issue. I think this issue of the composites paradox does need to be considered. We might need to step beyond some national accounts norms there to think about different ways of solving that problem. I think also finally, this is not just an S&A agenda. I think the S&A has a key economic purpose to serve, but in parallel we have environmental data from SEA. We have a network, the Friends of the Chair of Social and Demographic Statistics under the UN, looking at the social statistics realm and whether they need equivalent framework. And finally, it's never bad to finish with a quote from Mae West. I never said it'd be easy, I only said it would be worth it. And I think fundamentally, that's probably what Michael's saying to us. So I will stop there, I'll stop sharing and allow and pass back to you, Mary.
Okay, thank you very much for a very interesting discussion, Richard. I mean, there's so many issues here. Before I give you a chance to respond to Richard, because we've only got about 10 minutes, and we do have some questions already in the chat, which Michael, you can see in your screen, I hope. So could we, Sarah, start with the question by Joe Grice, if you could unmute Joe.
Thank you very much. Unmuted?
You're unmuted, but we can't hear you very well. So
I'll speak hard in that case.
Yeah.
I sort of feel a bit less optimistic, I think, than Richard in this respect. In this agenda of we don't think that that GDP is an adequate measure of economic success, has been around for decades, and people have been working for decades. And now, as a result of that, we've got schools, proposals for addressing the issue, but they've made very little progress in terms of the public debate. It's very much still a producer-led agenda rather than a consumer-led agenda. How do we stimulate the demand, the use of these kind of systems, and why do we choose Michael's system, for example, over one of the other many systems that we propose? And just subsidiary to that, what's the advantage of a GDP and beyond approach over and above cost-benefit analysis, evidence-based medicine, and so on, all of which are rather effective ways of guiding policy and producing rational answers?
Okay, thank you, Joe. I think we'll take there are two other people who've got questions. So Michaela, Becky, do you want to? Sarah, can you unmute Michaela?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well. Yeah.
So I put the question on the Q&A. Hi, everybody. One issue that has not been mentioned about the different factors that affect well-being, both objective and subjective well-being, is physical exercise. So when you go to the doctor and you've got high blood pressure, high cholesterol, the first thing they say you have to exercise more. But I think there's very, very little data, as far as I know, on different types of physical exercise, their intensity. And this is a question for both Michael and Richard. Do you think this is something that perhaps is worth looking at and collect more information?
Okay, thank you, Michaela. And Sheila Page, Sarah, can you unmute Sheila?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hello?
Yes. Yeah.
One very technical question was why these data need to be quarterly. I should have thought annual data were sufficient for outcomes and probably all you can get for some of the outcomes. But my more important question was on ignoring inequality above the minimum levels. What is the welfare argument for this? And isn't there a risk that in some cases the most efficient way of bringing people up to the minimum level is by redistribution from those only just above it? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sheila. So, Michael, do you want to respond to both Richard and some of these questions? You've got about a little over 5 minutes. We'll keep an eye and see if there's any other questions, but so far there's not. So
yes, I don't think I can do justice to some of the points raised in the time available, or even in my range of competence, because what I'm proposing would have to be done with a group of people with complementary skills. I'll start with the easy one, which is about the physical activity. It's something I've actually, in one of my earlier academic career initiatives, contributed to the evidence on things like active transport and things like that. And from a policy point of view, provision of facilities, particularly in poorer areas, of sport and particularly dance, which I'm personally interested in. I very much support what you're saying. So I think they're really important. I don't know exactly that they relate to what I'm saying. Actually, they do. I suppose they do, because one could count something that provides opportunities for physical activity as being a contribution to the sort of economic outcome I've been talking about. But I'd have to think through exactly where that fits in the overall picture, because there's a lot of other things to be involved in. The points raised by Joe Grice really require much more depth than I can give it here, but just getting it up on screen now. The first part of the I'm looking at what's in the Q&A box now. I think that, I mean, it's my personal opinion, and it may be kind of self-interested in the sense that I'm kind of wedded to the stuff I've been talking about today. And I think that a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of the beyond GDP work has just been so diffuse. That's one of the reasons why it hasn't been taken up very much. Quite a lot of the measures actually have been measured, but they're not influential. And I think part of it is because they're answering a different question. I've been answering, given that we're talking about the economy, how do we measure its success, given that GDP doesn't do a good job? A lot of the beyond GDP in that slide I skipped over, they're conglomerates. They're a lot like the New Zealand. I mean, there's a lot of good things about the New Zealand measure, and it's got a lot of publicity and attention. But it's not an answer to what is economic success. It's an answer to what else should be talking about as well as the economy. And in a lot of the beyond GDP literature, even going back to
in principle 1 o'clock, I suspect it'll be a bit past.
Sorry. Even going back to the HDI, GDP was taken as a measure of the economy. So it's I think that's the reason. So I think an advantage of my proposal is that it's specific to the economy. I haven't got time to talk about cost-benefit analysis or evidence-based medicine, but they have kind of they're in different domains to an extent, and we could pursue that discussion, Joe, at another time if that's possible, possibly on email or something. The third question. Oh yes, I think this is a very valid criticism of what I'm saying. Actually, it's about whether the use of a threshold has the problem, because poverty indices always had traditionally this problem that it's an incentive if you've got a single poverty index, that the really poor who could never reach the threshold would be ignored, and the people just below the threshold, there's an incentive for governments to concentrate on them and get them just above. I don't think my proposal is susceptible to that because it's multiple items. So you know, it is possible that people who are just below a threshold for something, like the example I used was housing density, who just have a little overcrowding, but some kind of minimal improvement would help them, and people would concentrate on that and not deal with the really gross overcrowding. It is a possibility. I think it would have to be talked through as part of this, and it may be that the idea of having multiple thresholds can address this. I'm attracted to that because you lose much less information if you've got multiple thresholds, but it makes the technical aspect of it much more difficult. So there's a trade-off in the advantage of or disadvantage of multiple thresholds and so on. The question about whether quarterly is realistic, I don't know, to be honest. I think that would also need to be discussed. You know,
Could I come in on that one?
Topic experts would have to be consulted on that, I think. Yes, please, Richard.
Just on that one, I think it's a question of competition. You're not going to be able to steer users who are used to a quarterly or even now a monthly feed of GDP to use an annual data point to guide policy, which is really what this is about. You know, the policy agenda moves quicker than that, and I think it's really one of the questions of capacity, which I mentioned in my response. That until we can generate data which is competitive with GDP in some of these statistical qualities like speed, frequency, granularity, you're going to be struggling to compete.
But it's not really competition, is it? I mean, yeah, go ahead, Michael.
Sorry, can I just add to that? Yes, I think that's very relevant, but also a lot of the importance of these monitoring activities is keeping things in the forefront of people's attention. And I think if one does it only annually, it's like Christmas, you know, or summer holidays. The rest of the time it doesn't really exist. But if it happens every quarter, then it keeps it in the forefront of people's attention.
I think we've run out of time. Did you want to say anything, Michael, response to Richard's particular points, or do you want to maybe discuss this offline?
I mean, I'm very pleased, obviously, to get Richard's comments on this, because not only because they're quite congruent with what I'm saying, but also because it kind of adds another way of looking at the same thing, which I just really appreciate it. You know, that there are some particular points in there, like whether the bads should be given negative weighting or zero weighting. I think that would have to be talked through, but I think it would be different according to which bads we're talking about. Some are harmful, some are just useless, some economic activities are just useless. So there's a lot of issues in there, but we haven't got time to get into that, I don't think.
Okay, so I think we have run out of time, but this debate will run on and on, and I look forward to reading your book, Michael, when it comes out, as I'm sure many of the audience will be, because there's so much detail in what you're proposing, and you can't really convey that in 35 minutes, but you did a very good job of trying to. So thank you very much for again.
Can I just say it's a very short book, so it won't take up a lot of people's time.
Great. Okay, and thank you, Richard, again for your discussion, and to all the participants. Okay, thank you very much. Bye.